Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Neil Bentley-Gochman. I'm the Chief Executive at the Whitehall and Industry Group, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this WIG session this afternoon. And we're absolutely delighted to be joined by Baroness Kate Fall, who's the former Deputy Chief of Staff to David Cameron when he was Prime Minister. Now, this session is about cross-sector collaboration in the first 100 days of a new government, something we will be facing soon in a few weeks' time. The session this afternoon, we are hoping to hear from Kate around what happens inside government, what's happening in number 10, those first 100 days after an election results, and thinking about how to encourage cross-sector collaboration with new ministers, how to support a new government as it's finding its feet. We will hear from Kate with some opening comments for about 15-20 minutes, and then we'll get into a Q&A session, which I will chair, wrapping up at about 2:45. So without any further ado, Kate, hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Neil, and thank you all for having me and for joining today. When I was thinking about this transition into government, I thought let's start actually back a bit and look at what it feels like to be in opposition with the possibility of moving into number 10, because I think that's where my experience related to what looks like is going to be a Labour win, never always know until the day, is important, because the sense of a team of people working very closely together over a long period of time to turn around an election result and have a new dawn of Labour, for us it was a new dawn of Tories, after many, many years of the other side ruling, is quite unusual, and therefore important to think about some of the aspects of that team and their mindset. So going right back to my experience with David Cameron, actually started around his leadership campaign just before 2005. And then I was with him for the whole time of those opposition years. Opposition is similar but different from government in many ways. You are, influential, you are political, you are out there saying what you think about things, but you aren't running the country. And I just pause on that for a minute, because that is the single biggest difference, of course, an obvious difference. But when you're thinking about that team turning up to number 10, or in your departments of state, or for those of you who work in industry and are thinking about your outreach plans, you are thinking about a team who have not actually been in the room making decisions and living with those decisions. That they are very political and they're very clever and they're very good at what they do, but they actually haven't had that much experience of that. So that is an important part of the background of working together. So when you're in opposition, you therefore build a sort of strongly bound team, and a sort of circle of trust gives you intensity and momentum around the campaign. And of course, when you then come into number 10 a bit later, that group is already very bonded. So we'll come back and have a think about how to deal with that a bit later. You're thinking about the direction of travel. Like with Keir Starmer, you're changing your party, you're thinking about why haven't we been elected before, and what can we do to make ourselves elected again? But not just that, you're also thinking, what's right for the country, what policies are right, what do we need to do? And with the early David Cameron years, we of course spent quite a lot of time thinking about liberal conservatism, modern compassionate conservatism. There was the sort of hugger hoodie. And all of that was sort of thrown into disarray with the financial crisis. And also the attention on us went out of focus, because, of course, the world needed leadership. Gordon Brown, it played very much to his traits of then the ex-chancellor and then prime minister. I'm sure you all remember, or some of you might have even helped put together that successful G20. Being in opposition, we were suddenly sort of not so important. But it was also important for another reason, because coming into that election in 2010, we made a decision, which actually, when I look back, was quite high risk. We actually said we were going to make cuts, and that there are two themes that often exist in all elections. One is the central theme of, do you want change, or can you afford it, e.g. stick with the status quo? And most campaigns sort of work around that. The only time when you see something different pop up is someone like Boris Johnson, who actually tried to be the change candidate after all those years of status quo, which was a sort of clever change on the theme, but still remains true. The second thing is that with Labour and Tories, putting this very simply, but it still remains true and relevant for the campaign today, is on the whole, Labour tend to attack Tories for cuts, and Tories attack Labour for putting up taxes. Now, in order to mitigate that, both sides over the years, and you've seen this time and time again, stick to each other's spending plans in order to neutralise that argument. And I think what we're seeing coming into the end of this campaign, Labour holding tight rein, not giving very much away, but you're beginning to get that old argument of, oh, hang on, what are they really trying to do? What are the taxes? What could be coming down? So again, interesting that that is re-emerging. And then, of course, another important factor, which is you're building a mandate as well. So with us, we took the chance because I think we felt things were so difficult. Unless we were honest with people about what needed to be done, we just wouldn't have the trust and the support to do those difficult things. So it will be interesting to see how that works out if and when Labour win, in terms of what people feel about how much they knew in advance. But we shall worry about that a bit later. So I think that the final thing I'll just say on the campaign is in the last couple of weeks, this campaign has been, an interesting campaign in many ways. They always are. It's not been high on charisma. We haven't seen many polls from many policies from Labour, but they have set out a very clear direction. The Tories have been running a core vote strategy. There is someone said the other day, they're not sure what core vote that actually is now. And actually that's an important point in relation to the strategy at the Tory High Command, because the Cameron majority, the Cameron coalition to win, as it were, was a very different animal to the Boris Johnson red wall Brexit driven strategy. And I think you see now the difficulty of running what in politics they call an air campaign, when you have two very different groups of people, because lots of the people in those old Cameroon seats, when they get sort of not sure about Tories, they look Lib Dem, they look sort of left and centrist, whereas the red wall seats might go back to Labour, but they probably won't necessarily return to the Tory party fold. So you have those sort of that very difficult sort of split for the Tories. Obviously, Labour doing very well. Quite a lot of don't knows out there, which I think is worth noting. Now, it doesn't mean that the Labour won't win, but what you don't know is whether that massive landslide that looks like it's coming is going to be slightly shaved off with maybe shy Tories who are a bit anxious about the landslide, maybe didn't like what Farage said about NATO over the weekend. A few things going on like that. So coming into the end, I think the focus is less on do Labour win, but just, how massive the landslide might be. So yes, coming into the end of the campaign, tax, landslide, Farage, shy Tories, what we haven't seen masses of is a sense of real excitement and a way, a lifting of the mood of the country. And that is different from the Blair years. So I was in Conservative Central Office in 1997, looking after Europe, which for what it's worth was not an easy task, I can tell you. And the thing you just couldn't get away from sitting there was just the amazing way in which Tony Blair communicated the sense of excitement in the country about him, about not just a change of government, but really about having him as a leader. I think that is something that doesn't exist now. And with that in mind, we'll come into the sort of number 10 moment, because I think it's important, I think, to think that if Labour win big, which they look like they're going to, there is going to be a huge sense of expectation. Of course, they will walk, Keir Starmer, if he wins, will walk in that door, number 10, with huge expectations around him, a great deal of power. He set out his values. We sort of know where he's heading. There's not a lot of retail offers setting out in terms of actual sort of policies underneath that, although I'm quite sure they've done a lot of work on that. But his personal ratings aren't super high. So I think that is also a difference in that other moment that I was speaking of. So here we are now with my experience of this. So I think my experience was very near to that moment when you win and you change, you change color rather than just win. But something happened with us, of course, which was we didn't win. In 2010, we fell short by 22, 23 votes, and we went into 5 days of coalition talks. Now, that was absolutely fascinating, and I'm very proud to have served in the coalition. I feel it showed that British politics can stand up and do the right thing in the national interest. The economy was in a mess, and we stood together with our Lib Dem partners to help do the right thing. So I feel very proud of that. And of course, if you think about that first moment you walk into number 10, for me, I'd never been there before. A lot of what you do is very optical and important. It's symbolic. You're trying to do things that speak to your values, that are showing people the sort of government they're likely to expect, the sort of man you are as Prime Minister in the case of Keir Starmer. So optics very important. Speaking to a fresh start. Look at the possible announcements. Now, some people on this call will know the Labour Party much better than me and will know more than me. But I think one thing to be aware of is I think there is still a little bit of jumpiness around markets. So whereas, of course, we had the famous announcement of the Bank of England when Blair arrived into government, that wasn't in their manifesto, if you remember. I wonder whether we will not have something quite like that. But we will nevertheless, see the fresh faces, the cabinet picked early on, then if they go ahead with the National Security Council, we set that up for the first time under the Cameron administration. We had that meet early on. Again, that was a sort of new thing. We announced emergency budget. Again, I believe Rachel Reeves has indicated that she won't do an emergency budget. I think that in itself is interesting for those of you thinking about policy and how you talk to government and the first few days. I think she's going to do some smart things if she comes in to help get those figures in a better place by the time she maybe does that first budget. Inward investment, just stabilizing markets. I'm sure she's got a whole plan. Now, for those who have joined, who on the civil service side, one thing I think is interesting is that moment when you, the core team, and I mentioned this earlier, you come in, you know your prime minister, you've worked with them, you're practically family. You call them by their first name. You know what's on their mind, how they work, what they think. You arrive in number 10 and you're exhausted. You haven't had any sleep. And you suddenly find that your new office is number 10. You don't know where you're going to sit. You don't you and then everybody is dispersed for a start. So the people you might have worked with in the same office will be somewhere down that, as you all know, the back rooms of number 10, number 11, number 12. You don't know where they are. You don't know the new people you're going to be working with every single day. In my experience, and I was very lucky in this, some of the best people I've ever worked with, I worked with in number 10, the most fantastic bunch of officials. But those are new relationships at a moment when you're tired. And also there's a moment of trust building, which is so important for civil servants and their boss. And therefore they're the ones that are saying Prime Minister for the first time while you're still saying David. And have to sort of check yourself. So I think trust building, very important, not just with your future boss, whether that's the Prime Minister or Minister of State, Secretary of State, but also your fellow, the people you're going to be working with for the next few years, knowing their priorities, thinking about and working with them about how, for example, they want the department to run or want their number 10 to run. So with us, for example, we had a tried and tested form of sort of meetings and people we work with very closely in opposition, where we gathered in the morning with the inner team and we gathered in the afternoon to do more sort of strategic policy stuff. And we actually brought that formulation in to government. Now that just sounds like, oh, what's a meeting? But actually, it was more than that. It was creating the conditions for collaboration and good decisions. Because at the end of the day, I felt one of my jobs at number 10, and I feel, I'm sure it's true for all many of you, is to create the right decisions, right environment for good decision making. Who's in the room? Are the right people in the room? Do we know what we're talking about? Have we done the background paper? Do we know what their policies are? Do we know if they work? Because that's part of what all of you do. And another thing, and I'll wrap up in a second. I know we're going to have a Q&A, which is those on the call who are involved with sort of national security in the widest part of the way. national security, of course, is something you have no experience with if you've never worked in government at the highest point. Lots of the team won't have had experience at making those calls, seeing highly securitized information, just the incredible responsibility for making judgment calls where you're never, there's no decision that doesn't have a cost. So that the psychological change is huge, but also, again, as many of you will know, it takes up a lot of the Prime Minister's time. So that the learning curve with that side of the house, I think, is very important. And some of you here might even be going with the Prime Minister for the first NATO summit, or there will be head of states meetings over the summer, which you'll be involved with. So also that intensity around getting somebody up and ready to go for those big moments, because that person's been leader of the opposition and suddenly they're, a statesman, they're the premier, they're leading their country, and it's very difficult to get someone really prepared to how that feels the first time you pop into a G7 or a G20 leading your country, and the responsibility and intense pride in that. So I think that's a good place to stop, if that's okay, Neil.
That's super. Thank you very much, Kate. Great insight there.